Now we're going to talk about something that everybody in security talks about all the time. We talk about risk, we talk about cyber risk, we talk about information risk, reputation risk, we talk about all these things. And yet we really don't get specific about what we're talking about. We conflate a lot of different terms. And because it really is one of those things that, well, everybody knows what it is, it's risk. But until you start asking people and they stumble or they can't explain it or they explain it differently, well, that's a little too nebulous for us to build our security program around. So we need something better. The first thing we need to recognize is that cyber risk is not whether there's an unpatched vulnerability or potential threat. That may or may not represent a risk to the integrity of the thing, but by now it should be hopefully obvious that that's actually not what we care about unless we know why that's important. So if we care about CIA for the sake of CIA, then we're doing it wrong because we don't know, we don't have any guidance, we don't have any guardrails, we don't have any constraints. We just make it secure, and there's no value because there's no explanation as to why that's necessary. So cyber risk is really whether there is a failure to deliver a business outcome as a result of errors or failures in delivering or using technology. Now, this still puts it in our wheelhouse, so to speak. It's still in our lane. It's still about technology, but it's contextualized in such a way that we can talk about it to other people and they are more likely to care about what we're actually talking to them about. So let's redefine risk then as the potential likelihood that something will stop you from getting what you want, because that's really what we are talking about. I have an objective, even if that objective is make it secure or keep it free of vulnerabilities or whatever else, the definition still applies. It's not very useful, but it still applies. So we have something we want, and a risk is the potential likelihood that something that we've identified as a potential blocker or interruption or impediment to getting what we want is actually going to take place. So what is that something that can potentially stop us? Well, I love this quote from Frank Abagnale. And if you don't know who Frank Abagnale is, he's the subject of the Catch Me If You Can movie with Tom Hanks. And it's really, he went to work, he was a criminal and then he went to work, con artist really. And then went to work for the FBI in their fraud division because he was an insider and he knew it. Now, some people love him, some people hate him. I happened to run across a talk that he was giving at Google on YouTube. And I thought this quote was fascinating. He says, I've worked every breach back to TJ Maxx, and this is what I've learned. First of all, every breach occurs because somebody in that company did something they weren't supposed to do, or somebody in that company failed to do something they were supposed to do. Hackers don't cause breaches, people do, and every breach comes down to that. Now, this is 100% true, and I agree with him. Unfortunately, it's been sort of misinterpreted by a lot of people to say, well, people are our weakest link, and if it weren't for the users, then we wouldn't have any problems. That's not what's being said here. We need to look at the reality of the situation in the environment that we're in so that we can make intelligent choices about how to protect it. And if we can come up with a way to group or classify things that gives us leverage and power, then great. So maybe this is it. Russ Lakoff was also talking about the exact same problem that Abagnale mentioned. He says there are two types of mistakes, errors of commission and errors of omission. An error of commission occurs when an organization or individual does something that should not have been done, and an error of omission occurs where an individual or organization fails to do something that it should have done. Of the two types, errors of omission are usually the most important. What didn't we do that we should have? However, accounting systems in the Western world only take account of errors of commission. So basically, we only track when people make mistakes, and that means that nobody wants to get caught making mistakes. So the best way to not get caught making mistakes is do nothing. That's not really the dynamic we want. There's also one other aspect here in this definition that I want you to notice. So if we've got two types of mistakes, that's useful because that gives us some potentially pretty powerful leverage, but it also means that it doesn't matter the motivation. So we can have malicious mistakes and we can have accidental mistakes, but it's still the same event. So whether the birth of the most trusted employee you've had for the last 30 years sends money to the wrong person, or whether Bob that was hired 2 weeks ago starts to try and embezzle money out of the company by sending it to people who shouldn't get it. The motivations are different, but who cares? Because it's the same event if we look at it the right way. And that actually is an insight that makes our job turn out to be a whole hell of a lot easier than we really think it is today, as we go around worrying about the ever-increasing threat environment and all these new vulnerabilities and weaknesses and exploits and 0 days and whatever. So it turns out that all that's noise if we look at the problem the right way. So how do we look at the problem the right way using this definition so that we can make our lives easier? Well, right now we've got a typical view of risk and impact. So we got this technology aspect and there's an objective, and somehow the technology achieves the objective. But you know, that link, it's pretty fuzzy and it's businessy and we don't really know. So therefore we focus on the technology asset because we know what that is. We're in control of it, we think, and we can do something about it. So we look for, well, all the threats that are going to make that technology asset not do what people expect it to do. So we got a threat that exploits a vulnerability, and we get an incident because of that exploit was being successful, causing the incident. And then because of the incident, there's some impact, but until it happens, we often don't know what the nature of that impact is going to be. We can't really predict it because we don't look at the whole organization as a system. And therefore, all we can do is kind of cross our fingers and hope that we can manage it. The implications of this is really frightening because here's where the traditional approach leads. It gives us a preoccupation with threats. We focused on technology assets, and we attempt security by eliminating vulnerabilities we can't really control. In fact, we often don't control the technology assets that are being used because we weren't part of the selection process. We can't control what threat actors do. We might be able to influence it, but we can't control that. We can't control whether there are vulnerabilities in any system. Now, we can put things in place to attempt to minimize it, but nothing that's technology is ever going to be defect or bug free. So if we assume that we can make it 0 defect or bug free, then that sets us up for failure right out of the gate. And that's where the traditional approach leads us. It's really down to what we can and can't control. And so what can we control? Well, we can really only control 2 things. I learned this from the late, great, legendary negotiating monster coach, Jim Camp. And he points out that the definition of control is to start and stop something at will. So the only thing we can really control is how we choose to spend our time, what he calls our activity, and how we choose to respond to events. And that's our behavior. Those are the only 2 things we can control. Now, as an organization, we can sort of cheat and we can try to control the activity and the behavior of the things in our organization. But that doesn't really work because at the end of the day, people are involved somewhere. And unless you really have a gun to their head and force them to, they're not going to do exactly what you want. And even then, they're not going to do it for very long if you're in that situation. So which makes more sense? Do we operate under the false assumption that we can control things we can't? Or do we live in reality and say, well, actually, there's a really small number of things that we can control. So let's focus on those and not worry about all the things that we can't control, but understand what they are so that we can be prepared once it comes into our world as either something we decide to go after, so an activity we want to pursue, or an event that can happen in our environment that we need to be ready to respond to. And here again, along with the definition of security, this actually changes everything because it's always a choice. It brings it down to who is in control, has a choice to how they respond. Always. In any situation, whether it's security or not, individuals, we always have a choice, even if sometimes we don't want to admit we have a choice. Because, as I mentioned before, control is the ability to start or stop something at will. So if we don't have the ability, legitimate ability to start or stop something when we want it done, then we don't have control. And this really kind of has deeper implications in many aspects of what we do that I'm going to get into today. But it's fundamental to shifting what we are focusing on in security, because we need to think and talk about different things so that we can see opportunities to do our job better that makes us more effective, because we have come to the end of the effectiveness of more, better, faster that we've been doing since the 50s. That's not the world we live in anymore. In the 50s up to 2000, we could kind of control many things. And now we can't. And it gets less and less every day. So we can, stand on the street corner and close our eyes and walk into traffic and go, no, 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 or we can actually accept the reality of our situation and try and think smarter about how we can be successful and effective with what it is we're trying to do. Because control is the ability to stop or start something at will, and that's why it's always a choice. So in our scenario of our traditional model, what can we really control here? Well, we can't control the threats. We can't control the vulnerabilities completely. We can't really control whether incidents happen or not. But we can control the vendors we use, and we can control our readiness and response. We can also control our understanding and design of the way we pursue an objective, because the more we do that, the less we're surprised about the potential impacts. The less we're surprised about the potential impacts, the more we know the value of the things being done, and we can prioritize our resources in terms of time, energy, effort, people, all of those things in the right place, so that the organization has more confidence they're going to get what they want. So this is the shift that enables security to really, really, really be effective. In this generic economic exchange, again, what can we control? Because it's important you practice this and think about it from this perspective, because it will change the nature of the things you think are important for you to do. Well, we can control which supplier we use if we're the customer. We can control the way we specify the goods or services. We can't control what they deliver to us, but we can control the way we explain to them what we want. And we can control if we accept or reject them based on our criteria, whether we've articulated those criteria to them or not. And we can control what we do if we don't get them. Actually, if you look at this basic economic exchange relationship here, there's loads of things where we can exercise control that will help us have more confidence that we're going to get what we want. Now let's look at the impacts that really matter the most. So if we are the customer, what are the most fundamental customer risk factors? Well, we can't find a supplier. Either no supplier can provide what the customer wants, or the selected supplier is not available or somehow able to provide the desired goods or services. I want to go to the sale barn, wherever they sell cows, and I expect to get cupcakes. That's not the right place, not the right supplier. I picked the supplier, but they can't give me the goods or services that I want. Next one is good or service is not usable. Well, either the good or service is not delivered or accessible by the customer, it was sent to somebody else, or goods or services don't meet the requirements. Rejected 4F. No, I don't want this thing. The third is my customer objective isn't realized. So either the necessary goods and services weren't available, the good or service has malicious intent or side effects, or there were errors and omissions in the application or the consumption of the goods or services. So one way or another, the customer could not do their job that they were doing, or in doing their job, a bunch of other stuff maliciously happened because something was introduced into the mix that they weren't aware of. So it looked like they got their job done, but in fact, they did 6 other people's jobs at the same time, and those other people just happened to be bad guys. So really, this list of 3 fundamental risk factors is where we can focus because this is what we can control. So it's a 180-degree shift in thinking because it doesn't matter how it happens. It only matters what we do to prevent it from happening or respond when it happens. Because our prevention is what we actively do to prevent something happen. That's our activity. And our behavior is, well, okay, it's happened. So what are we going to do about it? And this is how we get from reactive to security to truly proactive security, because we start worrying about the things we can control instead of worrying about all the things we can't and just waiting for them to happen so that we're, like the fire department. We can't do that. Security is not an emergency response function. That's part of what it does, but that's not all it does. And if we want to shift that narrative, we got to shift our thinking. Once again, true security is achieved by designing for resilience, and we just need to figure out how to do that. We only need 2 things. We need our fundamental customer-supplier relationship, because that tells us about any interaction. Each one of those is a domain. Domains have rules, so we've got a lot of power in that simple model, but we've got a generic model that we can apply to any interaction we want to talk about. It doesn't matter if it's people or technology or the environment or anything, because the model still works, because this is just a formalized way to describe a system. And there are systems everywhere. So any system we want to describe, we can represent using combinations of this relationship. And then we need the rules of the box. And those rules come from a generalized model of the SAMHSA domain that I came up with. And there are 8 essential attributes required to create and maintain the domain boundary. So this is what it takes to create and maintain a system boundary. And there are basically 5 plus. So there's a set of events that we need to be able to understand and manage, or decide that they're not worth understanding and managing, if we want to define what security is and understand what we are and are not able to control in relation to anything we want to manage. We just need these 2 things. We put these 2 things together and we got it. So what does that look like? Here's an example of how that works. So we've got a domain, and the point of the boundary defining the domain is, for some reason, we want to be able to establish and maintain that boundary. Now, it doesn't have to be a physical boundary. It can be identifying a collection of things that can wander off, like cows. So we just want all of our cows, but we're not going to put them in a fence. We're going to brand them and set them out on the range so that we can find them again. Doesn't matter the boundary, but somehow or other, we've got to define the things, a way to tell what's inside from what's outside. And that means that what we're really doing is implementing access control, right? Fundamentally, security is just about access control. That's it. Then we've got another element that's hanging out here in space, and it wants to join our domain. So what is the event? Well, if we're going to add it, then we got to figure out what it means to add an element in our domain. What are our requirements? So this element comes from some supplier. How have we specified the requirements to that supplier of what kind of element is going to be allowed in our domain? Well, here's where we use the rest of the attributes. So we've got identified, authenticated, and we need to understand what we want. So that's the identified part. And then we got to validate that what is there actually has what it claims to have, that is what we want. And that's where the authenticated comes from. This is all part of an identity proofing process that allows an element to be added to a domain. So now it's inside. Once it's inside, we register it and we give it a credential. So we've bought the cow, we brand it, and then it is available to any customer of the domain, because the only reason we need that element or allowed that element in the domain is because it's useful for us for this domain as an essential element of some system to provide the function to larger systems of which it's a part. So That is the value that the domain is supposed to deliver to its customers. So every domain is both a customer and a supplier, remember, because that economic relationship defines two separate exchanges of goods and services in order to complete any economic exchange. Then, once we've got a way to talk about what the domain elements do, well, we need to make sure that it's interoperable with anybody who wants to use it. It's no good saying that I'm going to give you your can of fruit juice if you can't open the can because you don't have a can opener. So you've got the right good and service. It matches the spec, but it's not interoperable with the facilities that the customer has to actually benefit from the consumption or use of that good or service, so they can't get the value. So the only way to make sure that they get the value is to make sure that it's interoperable. And then how do we decide who we give it to is where authorization comes in. Are you authorized to receive this can of fruit juice or not? What have you done to allow me to give this to you? Well, you paid me $10. Okay, great. Here you go. This is really it. So this is the core domain theory, how the events and the attributes work, because all of those attributes are involved at some point or another in the handling or initiating those events. We have to understand what it means in terms of any domain for those attributes and those events. And if we've got that figured out, then we understand what our security requirements need to be. They may or may not be feasible. They may or may not be possible, but we at least know what they are. And we got a really simple framework to figure out what they are because we've got our two basic models. We got the customer supplier relationship and we got the essential 8 and the domain events as part of the core definition of the enhanced SAMHSA domain model. That's it. That's all we need. Based on that, combine it with, there are really only two kinds of things we need to worry about, errors of commission and omission, and it doesn't matter if it's intentional or accidental because the impact is the same and all we're worried about is the impact. So we can look at it from an operational risk perspective and take those risk factors and apply it to our model. And we've got a set of events that we can use as the basis of trying to figure out what we need to worry about in terms of any interaction we want to model. So we have things like, are we authenticating the wrong supplier? Are we allowing interactions that we shouldn't allow? Are we registering supplier? Is somebody spoofing supplier content? All of these things are accounted for if you really unpack the definitions of each of those events, because these are the risk events that can keep us from getting what we want. So if that is the thing that keeps us from getting what we want, what we really want is confidence that all that stuff's taken care of, then if we can demonstrate that we have addressed enough of these events for any given relationship, well, that's how we measure confidence. Look, there's 10 things. We've got 20 controls for 10 things. Is that good enough for you? Yes or no? It's their call, it's their decision, because it's the customer's level of confidence that we have to meet. We can't tell them how confident they need to be. Now, the government might try to tell them how confident they need to be, but our job is not that. Our job is to demonstrate what we have done in a way that communicates they are justified in their level of confidence. That sounds familiar. That's the second function of security architecture, isn't it? First function is, how do I come up with the right plan to achieve an objective? Well, I flip the script. So if I think I need supplier A, then how many of these things can I manage if I'm talking about supplier A versus supplier B? Well, with supplier A, maybe I can only manage 3. With supplier B, maybe I can manage 7. Supplier B seems like it's going to be a better choice because I have more confidence that I can manage the interaction with supplier B. So that's the first purpose of security architecture. But we can't do that with wiring diagrams and blueprints of the infrastructure. We have to do it in terms of customers, suppliers, and value creation because that's what matters. Whether you're going to the store for a pint of milk or whether the enterprise is interacting with a third-party supplier. It's a human decision, and it's down to the way that we understand and evaluate the risks involved in any interaction. It's all the same, all the same. So then we can look at it, okay, well, where are the requirements? Well, the requirements come from the top. The enabling governance domain tells what it takes to be a supplier, what it takes to be a customer, what interactions are allowed, what the nature of the goods and services are that are allowed. So all those things come from the top to the bottom, and then from the customer and to the supplier within that constrained scope. So the enabling governance domain says cocaine is illegal, then the customer and supplier have to abide by that rule. So if the supplier says, hey, you want to buy some cocaine, then that needs to be prevented as an interaction or as a delivered good or service by the enabling governance domain, or potentially by the customer. Both are valid options depending on what your risk model is and what you're trying to accomplish. But the enabling governance domain sets the rules for the way that the customer and supplier will interact. And then if you're looking at the impact, well, the impact then bubbles up. So if we have errors of commission or omission in the interactions between the customer and supplier, then the supplier doesn't get what it wants, the customer doesn't get what it wants, and then the value that the enabling governance domain is supposed to facilitate can't be possible, right? But it can't be possible because of things lower on this model that have happened that are more fundamental. So the ones that are on the bottom row are really things that the enabling governance domain needs to get right. And then the ones that are in each of the customer and supplier boxes are the things that each of the customer and supplier need to get right. And if all of those things are managed, then hey, we get value. Otherwise, at some point, value is not going to be delivered. So this fundamental model gives us the keys to the kingdom, pretty much. It's a whole new way to think about security. It's a whole new way to think about risk. But it's not really new, because people do this. We do this every time we walk out of our house or across the room. But we're just making it explicit so that if it's explicit, we have a model that we can hold up and we can evaluate and see, is it useful for the problem we're trying to solve? And I can tell you from experience, having applied this model and my clients and customers applying this model, that it works. It has held up so far. But if it doesn't, okay, we figure out why and we fix it. I'm not claiming that somehow or other I haven't missed something. But the point is that it will self-correct, because if we focus on what it is we're trying to achieve and we understand the theory, which is errors of commission or omission are the only thing that ultimately are going to stop us from getting that, then if we understand what those are and who can make them, what else is there? There is nothing else. You can represent everything, including environmental risk factors, in those terms. It is the model to help us unlock the value of our security program. This is Andrew Townley, the founder and chief executive of Archistry. And if you're looking for a fast and easy way to connect your security program tighter to your organization so that it's unquestionably aligned and demonstrates value everyone can see, then I urge you to check out the rest of the Security Architecture Accelerator program. Inside the full program, you'll learn how to talk about cybersecurity in a way that the C-suite executives and the board will not only understand, they'll take action. Why we need a new definition of security that doesn't keep us locked in the basement, chasing threats and waiting for the bad guys to strike. What your security architecture is really for, and why it's not helping you very much today. Exactly when and how security should be involved with project delivery to ensure business ROI is realized. And how to apply SABSA in a practical, useful, lightweight, and scale-free way that you've probably never seen before. With the full program, you can not only start building more effective architectures, you might end up with a sustainable competitive advantage that the executives and the board just can't ignore. To access the full program, visit secvalue.me/SAA or scan the QR code on the slide now.